Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad that you could join us today for Decoding Project 2025's Christian Nationalist Language. I just want to remind everybody that if you haven't requested an absentee ballot, there is still time. And I think by the end of this event, if you haven't decided to vote, you're going to want to vote because it's very important. I also want to remind everyone that today is our Ballotapalooza, which means if you need help, then you can go online and we have live voter help for 24 hours. So it's really, if you are having trouble requesting a ballot or you have any questions or you have questions about returning your ballot, then they can help you today, and they can help you every day up until the election. But today they are going really hard and having 24 hours of help, which is really awesome. So thanks to all those volunteers. And there's one last thing that I want to recommend that everybody do. I'm going to put a link in the chat with some text and some graphics to share on social media. So if you want, it would be super great if you would share a couple of memes with some text to remind your fellow abroad people to vote or to request a ballot. There's still time, and we need to get as many people to vote as possible. We have to win this election. Also, remind your people at home in America to vote. So before I introduce our great guest, I want to share a little something with you that I've been aware of Christian nationalism for quite some time, but a podcast that I listen to, I'm going to say infrequently, the Benjamin Dixon Show, did kind of a few clips of people in the US, right-wing people who are professing Christian nationalism. It's audio only, but I hope it's just a very short clip.
Christian nationalism is on the rise, and people are thirsty for it. They are hungry for this. And we are the Christian Taliban. And we will not stop until The Handmaid's Tale is a reality. And even worse than that.
We need total dictator Trump. I seriously, and there's no argument against it. Oh, the Constitution says this. It's like the Constitution is invalid.
Donald Trump carries the prophetic seal of the calling of God. If you are anointed by Yahweh for a specific plan and purpose, you are a Messiah.
Men make stronger leaders. Men are just better. Men are awesome. I am a firm believer in the patriarchy. I'm a misogynist. You could definitely claim that. You could say I'm a sexist, absolutely.
It's not enough to be against blue-haired feminism. You got to be against women getting educated. Okay? Or else, what are we really trying to achieve here? 1999? We want to go back to the Middle Ages.
See the whole, everything going on with Roe, for example, right now, and all the left, becoming completely uncorked, losing their minds. They're saying they're coming after your gay marriage next. They're coming after your birth control after that and everything else. Well, you know what? Yeah. Absolutely.
There was this article from The Atlantic where it's like, well, Alito is on a mission to roll back the past 100 years of rights that were given to women. Yes, that is what we're doing. And it's only going to get worse for you.
They care so much about everybody voting in democracy, and it's like if you went back to the founding, and the founding fathers would have said something to the effect of like, yeah, women and probably feminine men shouldn't be allowed to vote because then their chaotic nature would manifest throughout society.
That's right.
I think our government should be run 100% by Christians. No Hindus allowed, no Muslims allowed.
It says, let the women learn in silence with all subjection, but I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man. So how is it that Christian women should be voting?
America is a white and Christian nation, and this should not be controversial.
All right. So with that, let me introduce our guest. Andra Watkins is a New York Times bestselling author, a survivor of Christian nationalism, and the author of the bestselling Substack, How Substack How Project 2025 Will Ruin Your Life. She has written for major publications, including Resolute Square, Salon and Newsweek, and she's spoken to grassroots groups, including Network Nova, Harvey Wasserman's Grassroots Green Book, Secular Arizona, and in various Democratic parties. Her work was used by the Project 2025 task force to prepare for the Democratic National Convention, and she's also been interviewed by luminaries including Arnie Arnesen, Rick Wilson, Stuart Stevens, and Jane Mantenaer. Sorry. I'm not the best person with names sometimes. Welcome. And I'm going to let you take it from here.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm so grateful to everybody who has given up part of their Sunday to be here with us. And I hope I give you lots to motivate you to vote and get as many people as possible to vote blue in your lives. I've put up a slide that gives a brief overview of me and my work. And Angela, I'll send all of this to you when I'm done so that you can make it available for all the people who have come today.
Thank you.
Here's a picture of my Substack, How Project 2025 Will Ruin Your Life. Since January, I've probably written at least 3 full-length books here on the Christian nationalism embedded in Project 2025 and Christian nationalism in general. So there's a lot of information here. It's free for everyone until November 5th. So you can read as much as you want to. And the best way to try to utilize this, if you go to my Substack now, is to pick up that little search bar in the upper right-hand corner, the little magnifying glass, and put in the topic you're interested in. And it should pull up for you all the different newsletters that I've written about that topic. So, for example, if you're interested in women's rights or female personhood or abortion, reproductive health care, put those search terms up in that search bar and it will give you those newsletters. Or if you're interested in LGBTQIA plus rules and things that Project 2025 would roll back, you can search for that there. So it might make using this a little less intimidating because there's really, there are probably 400,000 words here by now between what I've written and all the comments. We have such a lovely community of people there who are so thoughtful and intelligent. And I'm just so grateful that I decided to start doing this work in January. But I was one of the first people who was really talking about Christian nationalism as part of Project 2025. So I grew up in South Carolina. If you can't tell by now, I've always lived in the Southern United States and have that accent. And so I grew up in a rural South Carolina town in the 70s and 80s. And my parents enrolled me in a Christian nationalist school and joined a Christian nationalist church when I was 5 years old. So I went to a Christian nationalist school and church from the time I was in kindergarten until I graduated from high school. And then my freshman year of college, I attended Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia. So I spent all that time being indoctrinated in Christian nationalism, which gave us what we're dealing with now. It was ground zero for all of that. My church was one of the founding members of Jerry Falwell Sr.'s Moral Majority. So I saw the first abortion videos, for example, that C. Everett Koop did and put out as propaganda in different schools. We had all kinds of propagandists that would come around and say all kinds of things. So Christian nationalists have been working for a long time to get to where they are now. I have 7 tenets of Christian nationalism that I have put together that I think are really easy to remember and distill it down. And so I want to go through those with you. They believe that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, and you heard that in the clip that Angela played before I started speaking. They teach that from their pulpits. My history books in the Christian schools said that. And they also, in many quarters, believe it was founded as a white Christian nation because the people coming here fleeing religious persecution in Europe were white people. So They align very well, or have until recently, with white supremacists, because many of them are white supremacists. My pastor taught from the pulpit, and I say this in Belief 5, that white people were superior to black and brown peoples because God cursed peoples of color, and they used the story of Noah to justify that worldview. So many of them are white supremacists. They also believe that the Bible is the imperfect, infallible, inspired word of God. It is 100% perfect. There are no errors in it. They interpret it literally. So when the Bible says God created Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, they believe that was a literal event. It's not metaphorical. It's not an allegory. That literally happened between 8,000 and 10,000 years ago. And they believe every single story in the Bible is literally 100% the truth. So there are no mistakes. It's perfect. That's what they believe about the Bible. And they believe it is God's law. All God meant for humanity to have to live in the world. So they don't believe we need anything else to function as a society. It is everything that God wanted us to know, which is one reason why they're so prone to conspiracy theories, why they hate science, why they hate expertise, because we don't need any of that. We just need to read the Bible, according to them, and that's all we need to function. They believe that the Bible should be the basis of our laws, and so you see politicians in red states especially trying to make that come to pass. Abortion bans are an example of how they are trying to make their interpretation of the Bible and their view that the Bible says abortion is murder, which it doesn't, but they believe it says that, the basis of our laws. So they believe that religious laws, their interpretation of the Bible, are how we should be governed as a society. And they don't care whether you agree with their interpretation of the Bible or not. They believe their interpretation is correct. If your interpretation disagrees with theirs, then you're wrong. They are right. And they intend to force as many of our laws as possible to match their interpretation of the Bible. They also believe that the founders instituted the separation of church and state to protect the church from the state. And you can even find examples of Speaker of the House Mike Johnson saying that on the record in interviews. So they believe that there shouldn't be any wall between the church making religious laws and the state, but the state should stay out of their church functions. So when you saw people protesting COVID church closures as an example, that was a way that they get people upset about government interference in operation of church. They don't believe the government should ever step in and do things for a public health reason. For example, the government should stay completely out of church, but their religious law should govern all of us. And that is how separation of church and state, in their view, is supposed to work. Their politicians and everyone in these congregations are taught that because the Bible is God's perfect law, there's nothing to do to improve upon it. We should also not compromise on God's law. You heard Samuel Alito say this in the secret recording where he said we can't compromise to the reporter who was posing as someone else. You know, they really believe that they can't compromise at all because God's law is perfect. You can't give any bit leeway to interpreting God's perfect law. So they make horrible politicians because they're never willing to compromise. Over 100 of the politicians that we have currently in the U.S. Congress are on the record as some kind of Christian nationalist. And it's really horrifying because they apply their Christian nationalist worldview to everything. If you think back to Trump's administration, he was surrounded by these people, Mike Pompeo, Mike Pence, Sarah Huckabee Sanders. I could go on. And he was taking advisement from them about things like foreign policy. So when they moved our embassy from Tel Aviv in Israel to Jerusalem, that was a Christian nationalist move to be in line with their apocalyptic end times interpretation of the Bible, believing that Jerusalem is going to play a key role in the end times, which many of them believe we're already living in. And I'll talk about that more in a little bit. So they apply this apocalyptic end times worldview to foreign policy decisions, which is horrifying. We should not be electing people who subscribe to this worldview. And if you go to my Substack, I have 2 different posts about how to spot a Christian nationalist politician and questions to ask them or to ask yourself as you apply that lens to whether or not they're a Christian nationalist, so that you won't vote for them in any kind of primary, any kind of election. So you can use the search bar to find those. They're very valuable tools that I put together, and they're in their language. So if you go to an event online, for instance, and can ask questions, it will be framed in the language they will recognize, so they don't feel attacked, and they might be more honest with you about how extreme their views are if they feel that way. There are several different groups that are involved in Christian nationalism in the United States. I grew up in the old school Christian nationalist world, where they subscribe to this apocalyptic worldview that we're living in the last days of the earth. The last days of the earth started in 1948 when Israel came back together as a nation. So this is one reason why so many Christian nationalists are so protective of Israel and believe it needs to be a nation, because if it's not a nation, then their Bible is wrong and their Bible isn't coming true. So they will do anything they can to protect that nation, because it needs to exist for their last days apocalyptic drama to unfold. And so they believe that we're living in the last days now, that we probably have about 25 more years before Jesus returns and destroys all evil on the earth and reigns for 1,000 years. Mike Johnson believes something like that. Tom Cotton does. Josh Hawley probably does. I could name other politicians, Mike Lee, Steve Scalise, who believe that sort of apocalyptic dogma. So they aren't motivated because they believe that things are going to get worse and worse and worse and worse to do anything about it. They believe that making things worse is making their Bible come true. So that, and their Bible prophecy about this last days apocalyptic dogma come true. The New Apostolic Reformation is a different arm of Christian nationalism. It's newer than what I grew up in. It started in the 90s, and they have a different view of apocalyptic end times dogma. We're going to hear from one of them in a video in a bit. But they believe that Jesus cannot return to earth until they create a perfect world. So they believe they are charged by God to force all of us to live according to their interpretation of the Bible, because all of us who aren't are keeping Jesus from returning and making this heaven on earth that they believe the end times will create. So they're very motivated to take over the government. You hear this 7 mountain mandate. So they have 7 pieces of leadership that they try to take over and then enforce Christian nationalist dogma on everyone in whatever sphere or mountain they've decided to take over. And so they firmly believe in a form of Christian nationalist Sharia law that conforms to their interpretation of the Bible, and everyone should be living under that interpretation of the Bible. So they're a little bit different than the Christian nationalists that I grew up with. Then we also have, say, Catholicism, which is a extreme Catholic group of men that was founded by a Spanish priest who had paid homage to Francisco Franco in his dictatorship in Spain. Numerous people, including JD Vance, have ties to that group. And a lot of the people who wrote Project 2025 and contributed to it, Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation that wrote the Mandate for Leadership, has affiliations and ties to that group. Samuel Alito does as well. Clarence Thomas does as well. So Opus Dei is an extremist Catholic group that believes they are charged with taking over the government and making all of us live under a kind of Spanish Inquisition, Catholic Christian nationalism. The good news is they all believe different things about who's going to heaven. And they believe the other ones really aren't going to heaven. So one of our charges going forward, once we win the election, is to drive wedges between these groups by getting them to argue about who's really going to heaven and who's really a Christian, because that would break up their coalition if you could get the Catholics to say, well, only Catholics are going to heaven, for example, which is what they believe. So after the election, that's one of our charges. If we better understood this movement and what they believe, we have a better chance of defeating them. Before I talk about the next slide, I started my Substack with pornography. There's a statement very early in Project 2025 about pornography should be outlawed. Everyone who produces it or consumes it should be incarcerated. There's a section where they want to make anyone a sexual offender and predator if they supply anything they deem to be pornography to children. So many teachers and librarians and people like that could be registered sex offenders under their goals and aims. I started with pornography because I wanted to get right out of the gate and help people understand Christian nationalists speak a very different language than everyone else. When they say the word pornography, they know that you hear, oh, they're coming after my Pornhub, or, dirty movies that I like, or whatever. And that's true, but they're also coming after a lot more things that a reasonable person would not consider to be pornography. And you see the beginnings of that playing out, for example, in Florida, when a school group outlawed an image of Michelangelo's David because it's nude, and they wanted to call that pornography. So most art, in their view, would be pornographic because it either has nudity or has situations that are being portrayed that they would deem to be pornographic. Homosexuality and being transgender is all pornographic to them. And Mike Johnson is also on the record as saying that. So I'm not just making that up. They really do believe that all homosexuality, all LGBTQIA+ is pornography and should be outlawed. They also would believe that sexual situations in music and books and films where you're seeing sexual intimacy portrayed at all between anyone who is not one man married to one unrelated woman in a heterosexual sense, where they're trying to procreate, is pornography. So their definition of pornography could be really expansive. If you are in a marriage, for example, where you have an open marriage and you agree to that, and you each take on other partners and you've agreed to that, that would be pornography to them. Thruples, that kind of thing would also, any lifestyle like that would be considered to be pornographic to them. So I've given you a list of some things that they would consider to be pornography. Mike Johnson's little app that he uses with his son on his phone flags women wearing swimsuits as pornography. So it's very extreme what they would consider to be pornography. And I want to talk for a minute about where that comes from. Because at the beginning, Angela said they really hate women. And I want to dig a little deeper than that, because it seems like they hate women. And it feels like they hate women. But all of this women putting down is something that they justify in their religious worldview. And so I want to give you some means of where that comes from so that you can understand that this is religious fanaticism applied to the lens of women. And it goes deeper than just hating women. Christian nationalists believe that God created Adam in Genesis, in the book of Genesis, and when He was lonely. He put Adam to sleep and took a rib from Adam and created Eve. So their interpretation of that creation story is that the woman is of and property of the man. So they believe from the get-go, God ordained for women to be inferior to men. Then later on, a couple of chapters later in Genesis, when Eve gives in to the temptation to eat the fruit first and convinces Adam to fall with her, this is where you get, and you'll hear one of my examples say this in a bit, the temptress woman. The woman who is the temptress, the woman who always has to control herself because men can't control themselves. Women sinned before men did. Therefore, women have to suffer more than men. Women have pain in childbirth. Women have to deal with more pain and suffering because the female sinned first. Therefore, she should always be subjugated by the male. And they believe God ordained that. So they are forcing that biblical worldview on all of us when they say things like we heard at the beginning of this. It's all based in Genesis. It's all based in this interpretation of those chapters in the Bible and those stories. And so it is religious extremism and religious fanaticism being foisted upon all of us. And I want us to start calling it that. Instead of just saying they hate women. They do not like women, but it is because of how they interpret these verses in the Bible. And it is religious fanaticism and extremism that causes this view of women. And that's how they justify it. That's how they get women in these communities to justify it as well. So I hope that gives a greater lens on why they think women don't have a role in society, why they think women should be subjugated. They believe God ordained it to be that way. It's always convenient that men are the ones who say that. I've given you some other things that they might outlaw from a sexual perspective, because we're going to talk for a minute about sexual immorality. And one of the videos that I'm going to show in a minute is going to talk about that. It's going to give you a Christian nationalist pastor giving some of these buzzwords. So Clarence Thomas, in his ruling on the Mephibosheth case, I believe, I may be wrong about that, but it was one of his recent rulings, wrote in his opinion that it was the homeless, it was outlawing homelessness and making that illegal. He wrote that the next thing that they needed to go after was addiction. And he also wrote in a different opinion that we needed to go after the approval of contraception and the approval of, and married people using contraception, and the approval of gay marriage and same-sex marriage. And so the reason for that is because Christian nationalists believe very strongly that we do not have a right to privacy when it comes to our sex lives and our private moments. They believe, they worship fiery, angry, vengeful Old Testament God. An Old Testament God would judge a whole city and send hellfire and brimstone to destroy it if two people were committing fornication that displeased him, and the city did not confront them for that. So any place that had sexual immorality in the Old Testament was judged by this angry, vengeful, smitey God. I call him not mighty God, smitey God, because he would smite these cities for that. And so Christian nationalists take very strongly the position that they have a right to be up in all of our business, private business, because God is judging our country and making them live in this horrible place full of sin because we're allowing all of this sexual immorality. So they believe they have a right to make laws. They believe the Bible says they have a right to make laws that limit our sexual freedoms, because they are convinced that that is a way to stave off God's judgment on our society. So and I have two different newsletters about that if you want to read more. One is called Sex and the Christian Nationalist. So you can, and then it's the very next one after that. It's those two. If you want to read more deeply about where they get this belief system from and why they think they have a right to force it on everyone and how they're already trying to do that. If you listen to a lot of Christian nationalists talk, they are very against premarital sex of any kind. They believe that should all not be possible. They believe everyone should abstain until they're married, and only heterosexual couples should be having sex specifically for procreation. They don't believe that you should have contraception that prevents pregnancy because the Sex Act is for that, and that's what they teach. So contraception, when I was growing up, I was taught that contraception, the hormonal birth control pill, aborted babies, and believed that into my late 20s. So they really do teach things like that in these congregations. I was taught that abstinence was the only way to be, that I had to be a virgin on my wedding night, that my husband would expect that of me, that that's what good Christian women do. I was also taught, starting at 12, the girls and the boys were separated, and we were instructed specifically as girls on how to walk, how to talk, how to sit and stand, how to carry ourselves, how to dress in ways that did not tempt the boys to lust. So one of the primary things that we were taught in that world, and is still taught in that world, is that it is always up to a woman to control herself because men can't control themselves. So this is where you get rape culture from. This is where you get, what was she wearing? Where was she? Was she drunk? Was she, it always being the woman's fault when a man assaults her. It comes from this worldview that a woman always has to control herself because a man can't control himself. And I don't know how many times I heard that growing up. So how they would regulate our entertainment options, our private sexual choices, and our private sexual options is pretty extreme. Christian nationalists define a family, both in their groups and in Mandate for Leadership Project 2025, as one man married to one unrelated woman with as many children as God gives them. The man is the head of the home. The woman must submit to him. In many of these circles, they see the woman and children as his property, and women should not have any options that her man doesn't give her. And they're very clear about what they think the man should do to lead his home and subjugate his wife and children. So there are a lot of things in Project 2025 and in Christian nationalism that aren't families. Same-sex couples, married or not, are not families. People who live together with children but aren't married aren't families. So you would even start to see, if they're successful, them being able to refuse to hire or be able to fire without recourse people who just live together as a couple but choose not to marry. Single parents and their children, Project 2025 hates single parenthood. They believe that it's just terrible and that all children should have a father. People who divorce or remarry for reasons other than adultery are also committing adultery. They only believe a reason to divorce is because of adultery. So when you hear some of these far-right Republican legislators proposing laws that would get rid of no-fault divorce in states like Oklahoma, that has happened. They didn't pass, but they've started to propose these kinds of laws to do away with no-fault divorce because they don't believe that people should be able to get divorced unless someone commits adultery. Any other reason for divorce, they do not sanction. And so they would try to limit our access to divorce across the board for any other reason than adultery. Project 2025 is grounded in 4 promises, and they are all full of Christian nationalist speak. They use hidden Bible verses to make these promises and other Christian nationalist dogma that I grew up with. So promise 1 is to restore the family as the centerpiece of American life and protect our children. And the definition of family that they give is the one that I just showed you. So any other definition of family is not family and will not fit this promise. They are very adamant that that is the only definition of family that they're going to recognize, and it is the centerpiece of how they've built Project 2025 to function. Promise 2 is dismantle the administrative state and return self-governance to the American people. And we've heard a lot about Schedule F, and I'm not going to talk about that. In this part, they also lay out their fascism and their justification for their Christo-fascism. They say that the left is going to be upset that they're making all these laws and making all these decisions, but we just have to ignore them. They need to be ignored because we're right. They don't say it this way, but we're right and we're doing God's will. And so they just need to be ignored because we're going to steamroll over them and do God's will. You can see examples of this happening in places like Ohio, which approved an amendment making abortion legal for their constitution, and you immediately saw a group of far-right Christian nationalist Ohio legislators trying to figure out how to overturn the will of the people. Because if the will of the people contradicts their interpretation of the Bible, then it must be overturned. It must be ignored. So they believe that. You see that happening in Florida, which is one of the most fascist states in our country right now. They're further down the road to implementing Project 2025, them in Texas, than probably any other states. So you see them forcefully attacking advertisements that try to get their abortion amendment in front of more people and trying to threaten them, threatening people who've signed the petition for that to go on the ballot. They believe that they have to use whatever means necessary to ignore the will of people who don't agree with their interpretation of the Bible. And Promise 2 lays that out very clearly. So it is really their fascist declaration, buried in a lot of other things that people have talked about, like firing everybody in the government. Promise 3 is defend our nation's sovereignty, borders, and bounty against global threats. This is where they talk about doing what we ought, not what we want, that's what we're given freedom to do. So that is the buried piece of Christian nationalism in this promise. And doing what we ought, not what we want, is drawn from a verse in Romans. So they've buried that in there, and they've not said this is a Bible verse. They just quote the Bible verse. So that was one of the things that was interesting to me as I read all the different Bible verses that I saw that nobody else was talking about. So whenever I write about some of this kind of hidden language in Project 2025, I always show readers the Bible verses and where they came from and explain them. So this is one of those where they put hidden Bible language in a promise to say we should do what we ought, which is what the Bible says we should do, what they say the Bible says we should do, not what we want. You know, that's the real definition of freedom. And they believe that's what the founders meant. Promise 4 is to secure our God-given individual rights to live freely, or what our Constitution calls the blessings of liberty. If I say I'm living the good life, if you say that, what does that mean? It means maybe we got a promotion, maybe we got a bonus at work, maybe we're going on the vacation of our lives, we're sitting on a beach somewhere sipping a cocktail and just living the good life. You know, that's what that means to most people. When they use living the good life in Project 2025 Promise 4, that means the Christian life. That means the holy life, as defined by the Book of Human Nature, which they also use those words. And the Book of Human Nature is the Bible. So they define the good life as the Christian life, and they believe that the founders gave all of us the freedom, the blessings of liberty to live a good life, a Christian life, a holy life. Not I'm living the good life as you and I might define that. So all of those promises are steeped in Christian nationalist dogma. Kevin Roberts wrote this part of Project 2025. Kevin Roberts is the president of the Heritage Foundation, the man who basically said, if you resist, we will kill you. In an interview a couple of months ago, that's how I distilled what he said about committing violence. So he's also on the record as saying that we have to talk this way to voters. We have to obscure what we're really saying, because voters won't vote for this if we talk like the way we do amongst ourselves. They won't vote for this. So we have to obscure what we're saying. We have to put it, tone it down and hide it in other more banal kind of language so that maybe they'll vote for us and we can force them to live by our interpretation of the Bible. I am going to show you now a couple of example videos of Christian nationalists saying things that align with what I have talked about so far.
It can be for a generation of people too late. Too late for 8th century Israel. Too late for 1st century Israel. But it can be too late for every nation. Acts 14, God says he allows all the nations to go their own way. How do you know when a nation passes the point where salvation is possible for a people? Well, Romans 1, we've talked about it. Romans 1, wrath, God gave them over to sexual immorality. God gave them over to homosexuality. God gave them over to a reprobate mind, a non-functioning mind. So when you see a nation deep in sexual sin, pervasively affirming of homosexuality, and the insanity of a reprobate mind, where they make laws to criminalize righteousness and to legalize gross evil, that nation's under judgment. Amen. And the message to this nation, our message to this nation, if you say to the Lord, here am I, send me, the message is this: it's too late for the nation. We're under judgment. But it's not too late for the elect. Because, as Romans 11 says, some are chosen. They can believe, they will believe when we proclaim the gospel.
All right, so what is he saying there? He's saying that God is judging America. This goes back to when I referred to the sexual immorality and what they believe about sex and how God judges everything in the Old Testament's mighty, vengeful, angry God way. So they believe that that's what's happening in America right now. That's how they explain things like school shootings. Talk about Republicans mean when they say, school shootings are a fact of life in the U.S. JD Vance recently said that on the campaign trail. But you can also trace this to their raging thoughts and prayers when we have a mass shooting. They don't do that as much as they used to, but thoughts and prayers were also a coded message explaining or displaying what I'm getting ready to explain. So Christian nationalists amongst themselves believe that things like school shootings are a fact of life. Mass shootings are a fact of life in the U.S. because we are under God's judgment for our sexual immorality and horrible choices that are against their interpretation of the Bible. So they believe that these are things that we just have to live with. It's a fact of life. We can give thoughts and prayers, but Christian nationalists don't believe that it is their responsibility to get in between God and his judgment. They believe that it's really important for people to endure the judgment God metes out, because that's the only way that God may get their attention. That's the only way that God may get a nation to turn back to him. So when JD Vance says, well, shootings have become a fact of life and we're just going to have to live with that, that's what he's really telling you. That's what he's really saying. God's judging us, and it's not my job as a Christian to stand in the way of God's judgment. We have to endure God's judgment for all the horrible things that we've put up with as a country. And so these shootings are just part of that. And they're just going to be a fact of life until we turn back to God and repent of our sin and stop doing these horrible things. So that's one example of how they talk to the public and what they mean when they say things about shootings. Another example of this mentality, Missouri rejects rape exceptions in their abortion ban. Senator says forced birth can be the greatest healing agent. And immediately the left goes, how can he be such a cruel, horrible person? What hate, what awfulness. But it's worse than that, because what he's really saying, forced birth can be the greatest healing agent, and he stops there. But if he were talking to a fellow Christian nationalist, he would continue with, between the woman and God. You know, God has given her this baby for whatever reason. Maybe it's to get her attention because she's away from him. Maybe it's to point out unconfessed sin in her life and the way she's living her life is not pleasing to him because she's been, you know, immoral. She's been having premarital sex, whatever it is. So she has this baby now that God has given her. And he's trying to get her attention. He's trying to get her to give up this sin that she's committing. He's trying to draw her closer to him. And so, you know, if she will just listen to this message that God's sending her, then it could be the greatest healing agent between her and God. So when they say things like that, that's what they really mean. It's a very, very extremist, radicalized view of Christianity and how God works in people's lives. It's why they seem to lack empathy for people who are suffering. I have another example on my Substack of a Wisconsin county official who vetoed a homeless shelter for unhoused people because he believes and said in a public meeting that homelessness is caused by sin. And it's caused by the homeless person's sinful choices. And we cannot give money to these groups that don't get to the root of the problem, which is these sinful choices that these people make that cause them to be unhoused. So he would only agree to send money to groups that are religious in nature, where people who have shelter in those situations, like a gospel mission, for example, have to go to church. They have to meet with a Christian counselor who doesn't have any therapy credentials, but they read the Bible and pray with people. They have to do Bible studies. They have to write essays about Bible verses. They have to live by curfews. They have to give up their cell phones. They can't date. All of these rules that are drawn from Christian nationalist dogma that people have to live under in exchange for help. The same thing can happen in a women's shelter. They have to read Bible verses and check off boxes in exchange for diapers and food for babies that they were forced to have by abortion bans. So that's another example of how they view this judgment. This God is judging people for their sin. He gives people these outcomes because they make these sinful, horrible decisions. And he's trying to get people to turn back to him. And we have to not get in the way of that. We have to let people hit rock bottom. We have to let them suffer as much as God means for them to suffer, so that maybe they'll make a different choice and turn back to him. This is an article from a Fort Worth newspaper that this woman, who is a Christian nationalist politician in Fort Worth, wrote as an op-ed about Kate Cox, who, as we probably all know, had to go out of the state of Texas to terminate a pregnancy that was not viable. So this woman wrote an opinion that's drawn again from Genesis, from women are called to suffer because they sinned first. Women sinned first. And she actually says in this article that Kate Cox was given this baby by God. It had this condition because God meant for her to endure some lesson from it, and it is a woman's calling to suffer because women sinned first. So she actually uses that language in this op-ed that appeared in a paper. So they're pretty open sometimes with how they say these things, but they don't ever reference the Bible. She doesn't reference this dogma from Genesis. She just says it's a woman's calling to suffer. And if you don't know where that comes from, you probably just speed bump right over reading that and think, well, that's a really gross view of things. But you don't understand that she's telling you she's a religious extremist, that she's telling you she's a Christian nationalist, that she's telling you she's radicalized when she uses language like that. I hope this one will share. Can you see it? I put up the second video.
We still see the first one.
Okay, let me stop the share again and see. Okay. Now you see it.
Yes.
Okay. This is Lance Wallnau, who is a big New Apostolic Reformation prophet, and he's talking about the Jezebel spirit, and somebody in your group actually sent me this video to decode for her.
And what you're seeing now is a real Jezebel. You're going to see a lot of people saying that. It doesn't, it's like Pentecostal 101 when you've got somebody operating in manipulation, intimidation, and domination, especially when it's in a female role, trying to emasculate a man who is standing up for truth. You're dealing with the Jezebel spirit. What was accomplished was she can look presidential, and we'll go to this later. That's the seduction of what I would say is witchcraft. That's the manipulation of imagery that creates an impression contrary to the truth, but it seduces you into seeing it. So that spirit, that occult spirit, I believe is operating on her and through her, similar to with Obama, that there's a kind of an angel of light, charisma. You can see it at the DNC. And so when you're up against that, the good news is if we're going to go full tilt Pentecostal, Jezebel may be the spirit you're up against, but then Trump has like an Elijah mantle on him, probably from the intercession of 1 million Christians. We've got to lean into this thing because the Elijah mantle can break the spell of witchcraft off America. God can tear the veil, and unless that veil is torn, we have a lot working against us.
Okay, so what is he really saying?
Oh my God.
Video. There's a lot to unpack there. So we heard him talking about seduction, about Kamala Harris and this Jezebel spirit being seduction. So that's, again, we talked about where that came from. That came from the book of Genesis, and women fell first and tempted men to fall with them. So that's the seduction. But another thing that Christian nationalists also believe is that any other kind of faith that doesn't agree with theirs is not real Christianity. They believe that they operate in a world of the one true faith, and all other faiths are witchcraft. And they would use that word amongst themselves. They're demons, they're demonic. And they say these words a lot if you listen to them. Satanic. They believe that any faith that is not their supposed one true faith would be that. So we heard someone in the clip that Angela played at the beginning talking about how Hindus and Muslims and other faiths didn't belong in government, that only Christians should be in government. And that's a manifestation of that belief system, that anything outside of Christianity is a false faith and therefore is witchcraft, it's idolatry. They would want to root all of that out and make it impossible to practice any other faith or to choose to practice no faith that disagrees with their Christian nationalist dogma. But they also use Jezebel, who was a really terrible Bible character. She's not someone any of us would want to emulate. She was really vicious and horrible. She was a Phoenician princess who married an Israelite king. And so she's a manifestation of a number of things that Christian nationalists say. When they pull that out, they're saying one of several things. They're saying women shouldn't lead because look what happened when Jezebel married Ahab and took over, and all the horrible things that she did. Women are horrible leaders. She tempted him to go along with her, and he didn't stand up to her. And this is what happens when women are elevated to positions of leadership. It's terrible, and we have to resist it at all costs. But they're also saying, want foreigners. You know, this applies to their views on immigration as well, because she was a foreign princess. She was not Jewish. So they would also drag this out and apply it to Jezebel or Jezebel spirit, to someone who maybe they want to call foreign or other in some way. And they also use this in a racist context. And it has historically been used that way. Even back during the Civil War and before the Civil War, they would drag out this, people in that day would drag out this version of Jezebel as a racist slur. So there are several different ways that they apply that to our discourse. I am going to stop now, Angela, and let people ask questions. I've thrown a lot at you.
Wow. Yeah, for sure. This has been more than enlightening. Let's just put it that way. I have a question before we get on to all, there's a lot of questions in the Q&A, both on the screen, that in 9/11, after 9/11, I think it was Jerry Falwell, he said that this was a punishment from God because we had sinned too much. And most people took it like he was just kind of crazy, you know, that he didn't understand anything. But was he using this sort of Christian nationalist language?
Yes. Yeah. And the mistake that the left has made is that we just for so long dismissed this as, oh, they're just crazy. You know, and we never took the time to learn what they really meant when they were saying some of this stuff and how sincerely they believe it. Yeah. And so, you know, for me, my mission has been to get more people on the left to understand, or independent voters even, to understand that this is what they mean when they say things. And they really do believe in a radicalized way, many of them, that this is the only way our country can operate. I've got a question here that's really pertinent to this. What proportion of the US population identify as Christian nationalists? So Pew Research did a study a couple of years ago and found that a couple of years ago, around 65% of Americans identified as Christians. In the early 1970s, that number was over 90%. So one of the reasons that Christian nationalists are so panicked is because we are becoming a more secular nation. We're becoming a more multicultural nation. So they want to see more Christians. 65% is a terrible number for them. But of that 65%, they also drilled down into how many subscribe to Christian nationalist dogma. And it was about 30% of that 65% identified as either hardcore Christian nationalists, it was about 10% of them, or 20% were Christian nationalists adjacent, where they had some affiliation, some affinity for Christian nationalism, but weren't fully, wholly radicalized Christian nationalists yet. So that's a significant number of Christians who are Christian nationalists in the United States. It's millions of people. And so, and they do believe this really, really candidly. So how did I escape this? Wow. I escaped it. I was schooled to marry a good Christian man. That is all you're told as a woman in that world, as a girl, that your only use is to be a godly Christian woman, to marry a good Christian man and have as many good Christian babies as God gives you. You're supposed to be a helpmeet. That's a word that they use. That's a weird word, but I heard it all the time growing up, to your husband. And that's the only purpose for you in the world. If you go to college at all, it should be a Christian college, because you should learn something that helps your husband's ministry. And that's really the only use for education you would have as a woman. Otherwise, you really just don't need it at all, because you just need to stay home and have babies and raise them and help your husband be a good Christian husband. So I didn't learn how to date in that world. We were told repeatedly that we shouldn't go on one date with someone that we couldn't see ourselves marrying. So I was always very awkward. And when someone would ask me on a date, you'd almost immediately have to have this discussion about, do you know if you died today, you'd go to heaven or not? And I can only go out with Christian boys and all, and many boys were like, wow, this is too much for me, understandably. But that is how we were indoctrinated to behave as girls. Again, it was up to us to make sure that we were going out with the right kind of boy. So I never learned how to date. And when I was 22, I got married for the first time to my good Christian husband, who turned out to be abusive. And there's a memoir out right now by Tia Levings that you can read, who she had a similar experience and grew up in this and married an abuser. So you can read someone else's trajectory of that and how she escaped. But I lived with him for 4 years because divorce was wrong. I couldn't get a divorce because abuse was not a reason to divorce. JD Vance has also said that. So, this is something that they truly believe, that if a woman's being abused, it's because she's not being the good Christian wife that she's supposed to be, that she's not living up to her end of the bargain to please her husband enough. So it's always the woman's fault when she's abused in this world. So I subscribed to that because that's what I was indoctrinated to believe. At some point, my husband pulled out a gun and threatened me and himself. And that was the impetus that I needed to say, I've seen these scenes on TV where there's murder suicides, and now I understand how those happen. And so my pastor at the time, thankfully, talked to us and immediately told me to divorce him. There are people in that world who are not Christian nationalists. All Christians aren't terrible people. I'm so grateful for him for encouraging me to leave that marriage. And so I divorced him, and therefore I could never be a good Christian wife, a godly Christian wife to any other good Christian man, because I was divorced, but not for the right reasons. And so I would always be committing adultery if I got married again. So that made me start asking more questions about how I was brought up. And over the course of a decade or so, I deconstructed most of this. I read real history books for the first time. I read real science books for the first time, because I was brought up hardcore. Creation was the only science. And to be very skeptical of any science that wasn't endorsed by my pastor in my school. So I gave myself a whole lesson in art history. And so it really was reading, traveling, meeting people outside of the sphere that I grew up in. I had liberal friends for the first time in my life, because before I was always taught to avoid them. So it really took a lot of work to get away from that. My parents still go to the church that I grew up in. We have no relationship. I don't have a relationship with anybody that I grew up with now. So you do lose a lot when you walk away from these types of groups, and they're designed in cult-like manners to have these tethers that when you start trying to leave, those tethers activate. And a lot of people don't leave because it's their whole lives, and they realize at some point that they'll lose their whole life, they think, if they walk away. And it's highly possible that they will lose a lot. It takes a lot of strength to be able to walk away from a world like that and indoctrination like that. Are there any Christian organizations actively, publicly, strongly working against Christian nationalism and white supremacy? Yes, there is a group called Christians Against Christian Nationalism that works heavily with fellow Christians to call out Christian nationalism. John Pavlovitz is one of my favorite progressive Christian writers, and I subscribe to his Substack and recommend it highly, where he writes from a Christian perspective to condemn Christian nationalism. There are other Christian groups and organizations that are forming to do this, because it really is important for Christians especially to call out Christian nationalism for what it is. And it's not what Jesus would do. Jesus would not vote for these people. He would not endorse this worldview. So there are groups that are working against it. There need to be a lot more groups that do. What's the difference between Christian nationalism and dominionism? Dominionism is the new apostolic reformation that I talked about earlier in my talk. So that is the branch of Christian nationalism that new apostolic reformation followers follow. And Lance Wallnau, who we saw in the last video, is one of the preeminent faces in that movement. It's a Pentecostal, charismatic. If you're not familiar with what that means, they are Church of God. They speak in tongues. They believe in these kinds of fits and, having things come over them and speaking in tongues and yelling and screaming in church a lot and whatever. That's how they worship. And I'm not condemning how they worship. That's just their services are very active and loud, and people are very involved in them physically and vocally. So they're a very charismatic group. And so that's the dominionist string of Christian nationalism that started in the 90s, that they believe that Jesus can't return until they take over and make us all live according to their interpretation of the Bible. Trying to persuade my father to vote for Kamala. He is not religious. How would you go about presenting this information as a legitimate threat to our democracy, rights, etc., to someone who has been so taken by Trump's rhetoric? When I advise people how to talk to other people who maybe aren't convinced to vote against Christian nationalist Republicans, it's always really important to know what the other person's hot button issue is and what they really care about. So if it's protecting a woman's right to bodily autonomy, then those are the things that I pull out and talk to them about. If it's protecting a person's right to love who they love, then those are the set of things that I pull out and talk about. If it's the economy, I have a number, because I practiced public accounting for 10 years and I'm still a CPA, even though I don't practice anymore. So I also do analyses on my Substack of economic proposals in Project 2025. So if you put economy in the search bar, you would find those newsletters, and you could see specific examples of how Project 2025 economic proposals would impact real Americans. In a lot of my newsletters, I say this is how this could impact you or someone you care about. So I make real world examples of things that could happen. So I would try to find out what your father's hot button issue is, the thing that he cares about the most, and present Project 2025 information to him to help him understand why that would threaten what he cares about the most. And it may not be a religious thing at all. It's just really important to present it to the other person that you're talking to in terms of what they care about the most instead of what you care about the most, because that's not going to be as persuasive to them. Are there any Democrats who are Christian nationalists working in government? To my knowledge, no. We have seen in North Carolina, though, that they took the strategy that they had a woman run as a Democrat and get elected and then change parties so that they could ban abortion in North Carolina. So that certainly is a tactic that I see them dragging out and trying to do going forward, where they trick Democrats into voting for Christian nationalist candidates. That's why it's so important to learn more about this movement and to look up the newsletters that I wrote about how to evaluate these candidates and questions to ask them in their language and understanding what they mean when they say things, because they're very good at hiding their extremism when they need to, and they're schooled to do that. So we as voters, have to understand how to tease that out and how to get them to reveal more of it to us. How has this extreme level of unchecked conservative religiosity come to exist in its present form? A lot of it's come to exist because they have slowly and steadily, over the course of almost 50 years, worked toward these very specific goals that they've had for a long time. And we on the left haven't really taken it seriously. We haven't really confronted it earlier. We haven't done the same amount of work. And so they have been able to systematically chip away at our rights and freedoms and get to this point where we are sitting on the precipice of a Christo-fascist theocracy that they would govern with their interpretation of the Bible. So it's really important that people on the left take this seriously. This isn't hyperbole. This isn't exaggerated. Many of these people are radicalized, fully radicalized extremists. And this happens because when I was growing up, I sat in a pew when I was in elementary school as a child and heard my pastor say, at some point in the future, you may have to pick up guns and kill your fellow Americans for your right to worship Jesus. And you need to be ready for that, people. And I remember sitting there thinking, you know, some of my family members, extended family members, aren't Christians because my mom says they're not. So am I going to have to kill them? You know, and that's what I was thinking as a kid. But when you listen to this kind of dogma for 5 decades and you sit in a pew and that's what you hear, and you don't take any off ramp that you're given, most of those people are highly radicalized. And when they say, I would be willing to shed blood to turn the country around and make it operate the way that I think it should, they really mean that. They're not exaggerating. And I'm not exaggerating to say that they would do that. Have the goalposts moved with, I don't know what WRT is the end. You said the Christian nationalists see Jesus' return as being about 25 years out. Is that 25 years a moving target? Or has it always been around 2050? According to the dogma that I grew up in, my pastor taught, and pastors in these kinds of Christian nationalist churches teach, that the formation of Israel in 1948 signaled the beginning of the end times. They go to this Bible parable about a fig tree that Jesus told, where they take that parable and turn it into this prophecy about the reformation of Israel. And Jesus in that parable says, this generation will not pass before the Son of Man will return to the earth. So even though Jesus said multiple times, don't predict the day or the hour, you know, you can't know when I'm coming back, this is them saying this is when the end times started. And so they believe that the people who were born in 1948 will not entirely pass away before Jesus Christ returns. So maybe we don't even have 25 years according to them. This is why they are so easily exploitable by the fossil fuel industry and are such useful tools to them, because Christian nationalists don't believe we can destroy the earth as human beings, because God's going to do that. Jesus is going to come back and do that. So they don't believe in climate change because, I mean, who cares? Why do we need to preserve anything? Because Jesus is coming in the next couple of decades. And so we don't need to preserve anything. So that's a lot of the reason why they're so skeptical of climate science and climate change. I came from a large fundamental Christian church organization, so I'm familiar with this language. Presently, I'm a psychotherapist. I'm being sent more and more clients from other therapists because few therapists have the experience and knowledge. Can you identify resources that could help professionals and the clients they serve? I wish I could, and that's a great question. And I want to bookmark that to do some research and come back and give you some more concrete tools for that, because that's a really good question. More of us need to be conversant in this language so that we can recognize it, which is why I do this work and talk so much about this. If I had to learn this language to teach it to y'all, then that's why I had to learn it. And I'm not sorry to sit and speak it all the time now. How do they deal with the fact that JD Vance's wife is of color and practices Hinduism? And then, of course, the inconsistencies of Melania's work and their views about pornography. Women don't matter to them. Only the men matter, because that's what God ordained in Genesis, as we go back to Genesis and what happened in the Garden of Eden. So, women don't really matter to them. And they make all kinds of excuses to themselves for, why can you vote for someone who's been convicted of 34 felonies, has committed multiple adulteries, and is just a horrible human being? The antithesis of what most of us would consider to be a Christian. How do they justify that? Well, they come up with ways to justify that, pointing in the Bible how God used really horrible people sometimes to accomplish his objectives. They always have a way to justify voting for these people. And I don't know that amount of zeal has transferred to JD Vance. For some reason, the cult-like zeal just sticks to 45. But, I don't know how that would transfer to JD Vance. I do know that there is a lot of upset in these circles about the fact that his wife is Hindu and Indian, and that they don't like that, but they don't dislike it enough to not vote for that ticket. If Vance, for some reason, became the top of the ticket, that would probably become more of a problem. But, he's not the top of the ticket, so it's not as much of a problem to them right now. How did you step out of that upbringing and belief system? I think I've already answered that. What is the typical Christian nationalist stance on polygamy? You can't commit polygamy ever, 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 ever. So they would outlaw polygamy. And that would mean that anyone who lived in an open marriage, for example, well, that's polyamory, but you cannot have polygamy. It's not allowed. So people who allow that would be outlawed. What is the best approach when discussing these issues with women involved in this movement? How can we get them to question these laws and ideas that are not to their benefit? Scott, I don't waste any time with people in that world. It is a waste of time to talk to them. They won't listen to you because they are told to only listen to people that their pastors tell them to listen to, and the people in Christian nationalism tell them to listen to. All of these churches are run by dictators, so they have been schooled to like a strong man, to gravitate toward that. Women in that world are schooled to see themselves the way they see themselves. And one of the reasons, I think personally, I can speak about my mother. I know that my mother had different dreams for her life than her life has turned out. And there's a lot of bitterness and resentment that comes from that. So women who've been forced to have 5 or 6 children that maybe they really didn't want, but they couldn't say that because, they live in a Christian nationalist world where that's one of their only purposes. So they have these babies and they raise these kids that they didn't want. And they see other women getting to make different choices. They can choose not to have a baby. They can choose to use birth control. They can choose to go to college. They can choose to travel. They can choose to get advanced degrees and be doctors and attorneys. And, these women didn't have those choices. So a lot of what drives women in Christian nationalism is their resentment against the rest of us who've had different opportunities. They don't want us to have opportunities that they've been denied. And so that's a lot, that resentment, that anger, that bitterness. Those are powerful emotions. And we need to recognize when we talk to these people that they have these powerful emotions that are undergirding how they're reacting to things. It's another way to try to counter that. But it's difficult to reach someone who's governed by that too. So I just don't bother trying to talk to anybody in that world. My goal with my Substack has been to educate people who are not in that world about what's in that world and help people understand it so that we can vote against it and defeat it. We're never going to change them. To just keep beating them and beating them and beating them. We're never going to change them. So don't waste your time on that. How can Christian nationalists rationalize Trump as a presidential candidate when he has committed adultery and sex crimes? I think I've answered that one. Have any of the Christians ever actually read the Gospels? Jesus, who they claim to follow, said there were only 2 rules: love God and love your neighbor as yourself. If they want a Christian country, how about Matthew 25? If they think life is so sacred that abortion is wrong, and with a Quaker background, I can sympathize, where are they when the country supports war and the death penalty? There's a lot to unpack in that question. Christian nationalists do not worship Jesus Christ. They want to have their cake and eat it too with faith. So Jesus died for me. That's having their cake. But then eating it too is, and now I'm going to love me up some Old Testament, mighty Old Testament God. I love Old Testament God. Old Testament God matters. Old Testament God gives me the power to control other people and judge other people. They believe that the government is actually God's avenger on wrongdoers. That is how God set up the government to be. So if they control the government, then guess what? They're God's avengers on wrongdoers, which should horrify all of us. So they don't believe really in Jesus and don't worship him very strongly anymore. If you go into some of these groups, they'll even say things like Jesus was a wimp. You know, they think Jesus was weak and they don't respect him, and they actually say things like that. So there is no effort to reconcile Jesus' life with what they promote in public. They don't think that way. They worship Old Testament God because it gives them so much more power. I've already voted for Kamala from Canada for the state of Ohio. My question is, what do you recommend for those of us who voted because we won't go back, on how to face a future with those who will follow the Project 2025, because it will still be around us, infiltrating our society? The best answer I can give to that is that we have to be involved all the time in protecting democracy. Having a democracy is like any relationship. If you're married to someone and you only pay attention to it for the 2 to 3 weeks leading up to an election, you're not going to have a very happy marriage, probably. I mean, maybe it is if you don't like each other very much, but most marriages, most relationships wouldn't be very functional if that's how we treated them. So that many of us treat democracy and our freedoms that way is horrible. We have to be thinking every day about what we do to nurture and strengthen our democracy and defeat this movement, because it's going to be something that we have to keep showing up and defeating. And at the same time, we have to give them the message that, you know, you have the right to worship however you want to in your churches. We're not saying you can't go to church. We're not saying you can't believe all this stuff if you want to. You can believe whatever you want. You can worship however you want, but you will not force all the rest of us to. You know, you have the freedom to believe what you want, but you can't force it on all of society. And so somehow we have to give them the means to feel like they can believe what they want and worship however they want in their world, but they're not going to force it on the rest of us.
Can I just add to that for a second? Since you're all here, I imagine that you're Democrats Abroad members. So it would be really great if you live in a country with a country committee to do something with that country committee. It would be great if you joined our caucuses or stepped up to take some kind of a role. Not every role requires, you know, a lot of work, but after this election, it really doesn't matter what happens. We have to all keep working, because we're going to need to be able to, even if we win the presidency and the House and the Senate, that we need to make sure that the policies that we support actually get implemented. And we also need to make sure that we are unwilling to compromise or let the Republicans compromise these bits of legislation. so that there's always little sneaky loopholes in them. So there's a lot that everybody can do. And if you live in a country without a country committee, think about starting one, because Americans are everywhere. So sorry, go right ahead. Continue.
Yeah,
I'm
no, I'm
sorry.
going to get involved. I've lived most of the time in Spain now, and so I'm going to get involved when I'm back in Spain. So it's a definitely one way that you can continue to nurture democracy wherever you are, because this is happening everywhere. This isn't just happening in the U.S. It impacts you pretty much wherever you live. What percentage of Americans hold these beliefs strongly, would you estimate? I think I've answered that one.
Yes.
How can Christian nationalists support Donald Trump, especially nowadays when, as New York Times says, his rallies have descended into new levels of vulgarity? I think I've answered that one. How did you personally get away? I've answered that one. I'm wondering how JD Vance's wife or foreign race and religion. I've answered that one. Thank you so much, Linda. It's good to see you here. She is a regular reader and commenter on my Substack and actually sent me the Lance Wallnau video that I showed. So I'm grateful to her for giving me that. I didn't catch the name of the person who said it's important to obscure the message. That was Kevin Roberts. He is the president of the Heritage Foundation, which coordinated the writing of Mandate for Leadership Project 2025. So you can probably find a news clip of that online. I think he said that to a group in 2022, but that was who said that. What is your estimate of the number of Christian nationalists? I've answered that. There is no reasoning with these people. I've answered that. They say that Israel must exist to fulfill their prophecies. What does that mean for Jewish people? Well, okay, it depends. In the branch of Christian nationalism that I grew up in, Jewish people were really to be revered. We were taught that they were God's chosen people and that we should always revere and respect them. I didn't grow up with a lot of anti-Semitism around me. I was taught to be very respectful of Jewish people. In the Catholic side of Christian nationalism, that's not true. That's more where you'll hear that they murdered Jesus and all of that. And you'll see a lot more anti-Semitic behavior on that side of it. But I was taught that the Jews were God's chosen people, so they would be given an opportunity, a second chance to see their Messiah, to see Jesus as their Messiah and to accept him before being cast into hell. So that's what I was taught. Some churches don't teach that, but it really depends on the strain of it that you're in as to how you view Jewish people as a people. I was always very much taught to protect Israel, to protect its existence. And so when you see Christian nationalists talking about that, that's, they need Israel to exist for their last days dogma and Bibles to come true. Trump is fit to lead because he's male, in their opinion. Yes, and he projects the kind of strongman persona that a lot of these pastors convey from their pulpits. So as diminished as he is, I can't believe he really projects that to anyone at this point. But for some reason, they see him as this strong man, and he's emblematic of a lot of what they see in their churches. So yes, it's very much because he's a man that they like him. How do Christian nationalists reconcile their support for Trump given their beliefs? I've answered that. Much of this smacks of Third Reich fascist dogma. How do Christian nationalists feel about fascism? Christian nationalists are fascists, and they have fully embraced fascism as a means of forcing our society to live by their interpretation of the Bible. Their view of government is that we should be living in a Christo-fascist theocracy, not a democracy. They have given up on democracy. The strain of this that I grew up in was, we need to win hearts and minds. The Great Commission was to go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. And I heard that all the time. Now, their view is go ye into all the world and force everyone to live by the gospel. So winning hearts and minds is not important to them anymore. They're just going to take over everything and force everyone to, and that's fascism. That they believe in that strongly. How do we get rid of these people? You know, I don't know if I can use a bad word in this talk, but we're never going to rid the world of assholes. Whatever our definition of an asshole is, part of being human is learning how to live with people that we deem to be assholes. So we're never going to entirely get rid of them, but we have to defeat them in elections for as long as it takes so that they don't have the force in our government that they have today. So one way that we defeat them is to stop electing Christian nationalist politicians, to make sure at every opportunity that we're given to vote that we vote against the candidates who profess these beliefs, and that we keep defeating these candidates and root them out of government and not send people who believe these things into positions of power at any level of government. This isn't just about the top of government. One of their biggest, most successful strategies has been to take over county boards and city governments and things like that. So we have to be active at every level of government and paying attention to them at every level. How is it that women can embrace the Christian Taliban or Christian nationalism? I think I've answered that. What is Trump's connection to Project 2025? He denies one. Well, I did a big research project on that with some of my readers back when he denied it. And 27 of the 30-some listed authors worked in his administration. So he definitely knew them. But then we drilled down into all the different contributors. There are 250-some listed contributors on top of that who did some kind of contribution. And we found out that over 150 of those worked in his administration. Or we found things like they clerked for Samuel Alito. 5 of the contributors clerked for him at one point or another. 1 clerked for Clarence Thomas. 1 clerked for Judge Eileen Cannon, who's been such a big Trump supporter in the foreign documents, the secret documents case, and throughout the case in Florida against him. So 1 clerk for her. Bunches of them have ties to Ron DeSantis, either when he was in Congress or as governor of Florida. Bunches of them have ties to people like Mike Lee and Tom Cotton, you know, the name check people in the Christian nationalist movement. JD Vance is part of that. Mike Johnson is part of that. So you'll see these Christian nationalist ties also throughout the contributors to the document. But it's really hard to deny when it's that many people who have worked in your prior administration wrote this thing that you don't know anything about it and that you don't have any ties to it. That really is just campaign rhetoric, because he knows all about it and he'll do whatever he wants to do with it. Voting alone is not going to do it. That's absolutely true. We have to stay involved in protecting and strengthening democracy every day, and not just around elections. And so we have to keep working to shore up our democracy every day. What are Christian nationalist people of color thinking? I don't know, because, I mean, growing up, I was in a very segregated church. Obviously, we didn't have any peoples of color who were members of our church, because when the pastor's saying from the pulpit that they're all cursed by God, why would you want to come to church and listen to that every Sunday? So I didn't grow up in a Christian nationalist peoples of color congregation. And in my area where I live in the States, Charleston, South Carolina, the colored churches are pretty liberal. So I don't know of any congregations around me that are involved in Christian nationalism. They're voting for Democrats and are very politically active for Democrats. In other parts of the country, I don't know the answer as to if there are congregations that are getting involved in that manner. I grew up in the deep South, and I grew up surrounded by people like this, but they didn't have power then. I never underestimate these people, because they really believe it. When Trump won in 2016, I tried to explain that it happened because many people not from the South don't understand this. They were blindsided by Trump's win. Christy, that is a great observation. You know, I can't say enough. As crazy as this sounds, as far-fetched, as hyperbolic as some of this sounds, they believe this stuff. They believe it with a radicalized extremist fervor, and they will force it on all of us if they are given the opportunity to. So it's really important that we understand it, understand what they mean when they say things, understand what they're saying, understand what their goals are so that we can defeat them. Is there a chance for a Catholic versus evangelical civil war in the Christian Nationalist Nation? Absolutely. It would be one of the first things that happened if they won. We would have to have a holy war about whose version of Christianity is going to be the national religion. So I have said repeatedly that it would be great to get them to all fight about that before they get power, so that it could fracture their coalition. We should be trying to get them to say who's really going to heaven and start fighting about that, because it would make them fracture some. They're already fracturing on the white supremacist side, because the white supremacists don't believe in protecting Jewish people or protecting Israel. And Christian nationalists, many of them believe in that strongly. So that's a wedge that we can work to drive between those two coalitions. But who's going to heaven is the wedge that we could drive in the Christian nationalist coalitions to get them to start arguing amongst themselves. Is there a lot of hypocrisy among Christian nationalists? Closeted gays, premarital sex, adultery, etc. It seems there could be a big difference between talking the talk versus walking the walk. I think it's really useful to pay attention to what a Christian nationalist condemns the loudest. Let's talk about Jerry Falwell Sr., since we've already brought him up earlier. He hated homosexuality. He went on a mission to stamp out homosexuality. He called HIV and AIDS judgment of God because of the homosexual lifestyle. Fast forward a few decades, and we have his namesake being busted publicly for engaging in activities, watching his wife have sex with other men. Now, that could be because he liked to see his wife having sex with other men, or it could be that he was imagining himself having sex with the men. And that was what turned him on. We don't know. But and I don't care what they did, but it's more revelatory about what Jerry Falwell was probably really fighting. He may have seen this in his son and namesake when he was a teenager. And so he was determined to protect someone that he loved from maybe who he was. So they're telling you that they are either attracted to this thing or someone they're close to is, when they condemn adultery, when they condemn homosexuality, when they condemn other things. Whatever they condemn the loudest is what they struggle with the most. So if they're condemning pornography all the time, then they struggle with pornography. I'm convinced, like, Mike Pence won't be alone with a woman who's not his wife. He won't have lunch one-on-one with a woman who's not his wife, because his struggle is probably lust. And that's what he's telling you when he takes these extreme positions. So the extreme positions that they take and the things that they condemn the loudest are the things that they struggle with the most. And they may not be actively doing these things. They just struggle with them. They have all these urges that they're told are wrong that they have to suppress all the time. And so, being around people who are giving into these urges that they're supposed to suppress makes it harder for them to suppress them, which is another reason why they want to control all of us. I hope that answered that question. When we win this election, Agenda 2025 and the forces or people who created this dystopia will not go away. How do you see America in the next 10 years, since there are many out there like JD Vance who are younger and apparently smarter than Trump? That's why, again, it is so critically important that if you care about democracy, you spend time learning about this movement, spend time understanding what they mean when they say things, learn what they believe so that we can fight against it. We cannot defeat an enemy that we refuse to understand. And for a long time, that is what we have done on the left, is just say these people are crazy and I'm going to ignore that. And we can't do that anymore. We have to dig in and understand them so that we can defeat them and use the tools and their weaknesses that they have to defeat them. That isn't going to be something that we're just going to do for a month or two around an election. We have to commit to care about democracy every day. And I'll just keep saying that. There are sects of ultra-Orthodox Judaism that share many of the Christian nationalist beliefs except no Jesus. There are sects of Islam that share the same beliefs. So it's not just a U.S. Christian problem. How can we fight the general problem of religious extremism? One of the ways to do that is to get involved wherever you are. Maybe you can't vote in Germany, but you can pay attention to the politics there because, I mean, you're struggling with far-right things there. We're struggling with it in Spain. Italy is governed by a far-right government. And a lot of the things that Giorgia Meloni puts forth are Christian nationalist type beliefs, where they just outlawed surrogacy as an example, because they want to remove the opportunity for same-sex couples to have children. And so, you know, they're very anti-LGBTQ in that government and are doing things to suppress that loving who you love and being who you are. So this isn't just a problem in the US. It's really important, if you have friends who can vote in these countries, that you're helping them understand that this is something that the US is exporting. They are exporting right now and spending a lot of money on trying to roll back abortion protections in countries that think that's settled. So they had the success in the US and now they intend to export it worldwide. So I go to language school in San Sebastian, Spain, where I live, and 2 blocks away, there's a plaza where they have someone who stands sometimes with a sign that says abortion is murder. And that's all they do all day. And when somebody comes by, they give them pamphlets and paperwork in Spanish or Euskera, because they speak 2 languages in that sector of Spain, to say we need to outlaw abortion, even though it's legal in Spain nationwide. So that's an example of things that they're doing on the ground to try to sow these kinds of beliefs in a grassroots manner. And we have to fight back against that in a grassroots manner. Just because it's legal doesn't mean it always will be. We have to constantly make sure that we're confronting these grassroots efforts to whittle away our rights. Do you have an opinion on the best way to concisely message about the threat without castigating Christians as a broad group? I hope I don't castigate Christians as a broad group. I have a lot of Christians reading my Substack. It's really important to say that there are plenty of Christians who are wonderful people who do not practice this at all. And some of them aren't really aware that this Christian nationalist strain is even happening, so they can feel attacked when you say Christian nationalist. So I try very hard to define what I'm talking about when I talk about Christian nationalists, because not all Christians are Christian nationalists. And that's how I try to do it. I try to make differentiations between these sects. And it's really helpful when some of my Christian readers comment and give additional insights on how they see and how they want it to be framed. And so there are lots of discussions on my Substack about that kind of thing. How do Christian nationalist lawmakers square the beliefs with freedom of religion and the Constitution? They believe all the framers and founders of the country were Christians. And they believe that that means that we were all meant to be Christians, that the Constitution is a Christian document, that it was meant to govern the United States as a Christian nation. That's what they believe. So, you know, that's really where originalism comes from, a way to take these circular arguments that they make when you try to have a conversation with them about faith, and they just answer with these thought-terminating cliches. You're trained to do that in that world, so you just constantly throw those out until you can't have a discussion with someone like that. That's what originalism is. You know, you can't ask God what a verse means in the Bible, so you just do this thought-terminating thing. Well, you can't dig up the founders and ask them what they meant when they wrote the Constitution, so they can apply these thought-terminating cliches to that as well. So that's kind of how Leonard Leo came up with originalism, and how they developed it as a means of legal thought. Much of this sounds very similar to Amish teachings. Is that true? I don't know a lot about the Amish movement, so I don't know whether that's true or not. How clear are the Republican leaders who support a Trumpist view on what's really going on with this voting bloc? And why do we hear nothing in the press from Christian leaders who are not nationalists warning about these issues? There's a lot of discussion right now about the media, the mainstream corporate media in the United States. Most of it is owned now by Trump supporting billionaires. So it's really hard to get a message that doesn't align with those people's desired outcome into any national media. So it's just really hard to get a message across right now. Substack is one of the places that I go for a lot of my news, because there are a lot of really good independent writers and reporters and journalists there who are making good news that is a lot more useful than a lot of what's happening in corporate media. Have you done a line-by-line analysis of Project 2025? Your 4 bullets are great. On my Substack, I read the whole thing. I'm going to drink a little water. I read the whole thing to write about it. I didn't think that I should skim it to write about it. So I have the stack over here. I can bring it and show it to you. It's all marked up and all dog-eared and a mess now because I've carried it around for months and months. But I read the whole thing. I highlighted, I made notes about what I wanted to talk about. If you go to my Substack, I have different bullet pointed cards that you can find. And I've done a lot more of those over the past couple of weeks on different topics. They're printable, they're shareable on social media. So, and hopefully they're useful for people who have specific things they care about. So if they care about LGBTQ autonomy and freedom, for example, you can print those or share those with them to say this is what Project 2025 could do to people in your life who are LGBTQ. So I have a lot of those on my Substack, and you can find them if you go there. Can you actually teach these people about modern science? No, you cannot. They do not accept modern science because it goes against their interpretation of the Bible. When you say domination, what is truly their end goal, and what does it look like to the American people? Their end goal is to make the whole world live under their Christian nationalist dogma, because then Jesus can return. That's their end goal. And that's what they are going to keep working toward, and what we have to keep defeating. Any tips on how we can free Israeli policy from the grip of Christian nationalists? Stop electing Christian nationalists. Just stop electing them, and we'll eventually free ourselves of that. What are young boys taught in Christian nationalist communities? Young boys are taught that they can't control themselves, and the girls around them are always tempting them, that boys always have to view women as temptress and the girls as temptresses, and constantly be on guard for what women are going to do to try to tempt them to sin. They're also taught that they are the leaders and that they deserve respect, even if they don't earn it. They're taught that they are the special ones. So, I mean, I have a brother. I grew up in this. So I was the family toilet as the girl, and my brother was the Messiah as the boy. So there's always this dynamic where the boys in these households are always just the greatest things ever, need to be protected, need to be coddled, need to be told they're special, need to be told that they're the leaders. So you see men coming out of this world, and maybe the world doesn't work that way. And that's why a lot of them become so angry, because they were coddled, they were babied, they were told they were special all growing up. And then they get out into a world that doesn't work that way. And they really struggle and get angry and become resentful and become incels and have problems. Where is the next laboratory that you see is coming under Christian nationalist control? You've already mentioned Florida and Texas are pretty far gone. Missouri and Oklahoma are obviously in a bad way. What's the next big place to focus on halting the slide? Any red state is further down the road of Project 2025. So, you named several, but any red state that you can name. Mississippi, Alabama's terrible. Tennessee, they've basically rejected democracy in Tennessee. So lots of red states are further down the road, and it's really important. One of the things that I gave money to this year to support was flipping the Arizona State House blue. It's so close. So I use a site called blue24.org, which organizes races by winnable races and then puts them in individual pots so that you can donate to those races and to the people in those races. individually, and 100% of the money goes to them. It doesn't go through some conduit that takes some of the money. So I've given to try to flip Arizona blue. I've given to an effort to hold Michigan. So flipping more of these state houses is going to be really, really, really critical to defeating this. And they focused on that for a long time. So giving and supporting efforts like that to try to flip some of these more of these state houses blue is important. Who determines what their interpretation of the Bible is correct? The male leaders do. And if my pastor said this is what the Bible means when it says this, then that's what it meant. And you couldn't question that at all. You were taught not to question him. He had the direct conduit to God, and he knew more about what God meant than I did or anybody in the congregation did. Not perfect, just forgiven. Is there a way to exploit internal disagreements between the differing? I've talked about that. And so how can Christian nationalist fundamentalists reconcile their religious beliefs with the support for Trump? I've answered that. How do Christian nationalists compare with Christian Zionists? I would say that most Christian nationalists are Christian Zionists because they believe that Israel has to exist for their Bibles to come true. So they very much believe in Zion. Will they obey the laws under Harris and Walls? Some of them will. I believe many of them won't. Many of them believe that when a law differs from their interpretation of the Bible, they have a right to break that law and ignore that law. We see Greg Abbott doing that in Texas when the administration tries to force him to practice federal laws that he disagrees with. We see that in the lawsuits about EMTALA with providing abortions in emergency situations in 3 different states, that they brought a new lawsuit about that. So, they really believe that they don't have to follow laws that violate their interpretation of the Bible. And some of them would go as far as to defy laws that do that. They say that Israel must exist to fulfill their prophecies. What does that mean for the Jewish people? Hopefully it means they care about the Jewish people, but I really personally think they just care that the land exists. I really don't think they care about the Jewish people at all. This is not a question, but a situation that happened in my family. My brother and his wife were Christian nationalists. They had 10 children, and when one of their children confessed to them that he was gay, he and his wife discussed their options. Either they could shun their own child or they could reassess their beliefs. Thankfully, they did the latter. Sometimes that happens, and that's really great when that happens. And now I'm getting thank yous. I realize this is impossible to answer definitively, but do you think that the majority of elected officials who claim to be part of this movement actually believe? Yes, I do. I've answered that. They actually believe in these things and would force us to live by them. She is sharing this recording. What about Clarence Thomas, a Black conservative Catholic? How does he fit? Is he a tool, a means, as Trump is? Or Clarence Thomas is one of the biggest dangers to our country. He's a fully radicalized Christian nationalist, dominionist, Opus Dei Catholic. He would take us back to the Middle Ages. He's one of those people who would have said that in Angela's first recording. He believes very strongly in these things and is a horrible danger to our country and needs to be addressed on the Supreme Court, in my view. Do you see any similarities with the Russian Orthodox Church and their collaboration with other Christian nationalist movements? Well, the Russian Orthodox Church is Putin's version of Christian nationalism in Russia. So he operates similarly. Obviously, he has a fascist government and can use it a lot more fully than they can in the US. But that is a picture of how it could work in the US if Christian nationalists win. And on that note, I didn't get to all your questions, but Angela says we're going to wrap up. So if there's some way that I can go through them after and answer them, I'll be happy to.
Yeah, I can send you the questions from the Q&A box.
Okay.
I just want to thank everybody that came today, is still here. This is a very in-depth subject, and I would definitely advise you to go to the Substack and read it. There's a lot of information out there. I mean, that she's taken the time to write, and we should really inform ourselves, because this is a dangerous situation, and that's been brewing for quite some time. It's not new. I've been encountering these people for many, many years, for at least 30 years. I've been encountering them. And believe me, they don't like me. For many reasons. I'm not a woman that sits quietly in the corner and doesn't say anything. So that's always a problem. We want to thank you so much, Andra, for coming today. This has been really great. Thank you for spending so much time with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's been our pleasure. As I've stated in the chat and in a lot of the Q&As, I will send out the recording. And to everybody who RSVP'd, it'll also be on our YouTube channel, and it is right now on our Facebook. So it's going to be available for everyone. Please, if you haven't voted, or you know people who haven't voted, please tell them to, and they're overseas, tell them to go to votefromabroad.org. There is still time to request a ballot. If you have people in the States, ask them to go to iwillvote.com to verify their voting. Make sure that they are registered, and in many places it's still time to get registered. And with that, thanks everybody, and we'll see you the next time.
Bye.
Bye.